So, again, chapter 14, verse 1. And we're going to have a series of laws now. And this whole section of Deuteronomy is legal. It's going to take us through the end of this year and beyond. And we're beginning with a couple of laws that talk about special Jewish responsibilities as God's chosen people, God's special treasure. So, and it begins, chapter 14, Banim atem ladonai Elohechem. You are children of the Lord your God. So this is one of several ways in which our relationship with God is described. We are sometimes called avadim. We are God's servants, or even if you want to put it, because the word itself can be used in a variety of ways, God's slaves. And God took us out of Egypt, the house of bondage, to make us bound to God, right? So we've replaced a bad master, an evil master, with a good one. Here, the relationship is of a parent to a child. And presumably, though, elsewhere in the Torah, we're told that every human being is created in God's image. There is a sense in which we have this special relationship as though we are intimately related to God as a parent is to a child. And that means that there are certain things that we as this special people do, which others are not required to do. This is an example of our elevated status, which imposes not only certain privileges, perhaps, though even the privileges are sort of unclear, but special responsibilities. Here we get something which is a little bit surprising to us, though it wasn't surprising to people in antiquity. And this has to do with how the dead are to be mourned. If you just joined us in the last minute or two, we're on chapter 14 of the book of Deuteronomy, and we're just starting verse 1.
What page
Page
is that?
1072, if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash. So we are told about how the dead are to be mourned. And it's worth mentioning, I think, parenthetically, that ways in which we are to mourn the dead have changed dramatically from biblical times through rabbinic times and even up to our own day. To give you, we're going to see here that in ancient times, other people would mourn their dead by gnashing themselves, cutting themselves, or shaving the front of their heads. Right? Up here, some of us, it wouldn't matter if we shaved our heads or not, right? But we're not supposed to do this. Now, we have a whole host of regulations about sitting Shiva and what one may or may not do during Shiva and staying low to the ground and all of that. That's not in the biblical text. In fact, we're not told here that we may not do this or that, except for this. The closest thing we come to something which has sort of continued, although in a different form, is this idea not of shaving the front of your head, but of men not shaving during the period of Shiva. But there were all kinds of ancient regulations, even in the rabbinic period. I'm studying now a section of the Talmud which deals with the various laws of mourning. It's in a tractate called Moed Katan, which usually deals with the intermediate periods during the holidays. But it has a whole long section on how the dead are to be mourned. And to give you one example, there was a tradition among Jews in the rabbinic period that they had to turn their beds upside down. And that was part when we sit Shiva on the floor, but they or on a low stool, but they turn their beds upside down. To give you another example, though not quite about mourning, but treatment of the dead, it's absolutely clear that Abraham and his family are not, buried in the ground, but they're placed in a burial cave, the cave of the Machpelah. In the rabbinic period, we know that death was treated differently as well. And so in some sort of a cavern or a structure, the body was laid out until the flesh disappeared. And then the bones were gathered and placed in bone boxes, which were called ossuaries. Right. So very different from today. And it's worth noting there are people who are, people who would say, well, you can't do above ground burial. And that's been our tradition for over 1,000 years. But it's worth noting that it wasn't always the tradition. So here we have an ancient tradition, and we are told that this practice or these practices of shaving the forehead or ritually gnashing ourselves were not permitted. The idea of cutting yourself seems to have been a pagan practice. There's a scene with the prophet Elijah who goes head to head against the prophets of the Canaanite god Baal. And one thing that they do in order to attract their god's attention is to cut themselves. Right? So this is some kind of a pagan ritual. And here wasn't just prophets, but everybody was doing it. Jews are not allowed to do it. And I think it's worth noting also that to say that we are Am Kadosh, a holy people or a consecrated people, vis-a-vis the other families of the world, the other peoples of the world, is somewhat similar to the relationship between the priests, the Kohanim, and the Jewish people as a whole, right? So the priests are the most holy, and they are set aside, the Kohanim, from the rest of the people. Right? And they have special rules. And one of those rules, as you're probably aware, is and this goes as a tradition even to their descendants today. If you are a Kohen, the son of a Kohen, tradition of not going to the cemetery. Or at the burial, you would stand in the road rather than be at the grave, because the dead were viewed as giving a certain ritual impurity, which would preclude the Kohen, the priest, from offering sacrifices, right? So there are special rules if you are a priest in terms of how you relate to the dead. And here, as a priest's people, as it were, and actually that expression is used in the book of Exodus, Mamlechet Kohanim, Goy Kadosh, a nation of priests, a holy people. So it's perhaps not surprising that here the Torah is suggesting that the whole people of Israel has special traditions around the dead, prohibitions really around the dead. Now, so we start there as part of our holiness as a people. We have this restriction, and we move on now in verse 3 to another one, much better known because it persists to this day, and that is not to eat any to'eva, anything that is abhorrent. That is, because you're Jewish and you're part of this special people, you're set aside from the other nations, you have to be careful about what you eat so that you maintain a certain sense of sanctity, right? And the idea here is you are what you eat, right? So you have to eat holy food in order. Now, there's no inherent reason why some animals are are okay and other animals are not. We're going to get a description of what qualifies them, but there's no inherent reason why pigs are somehow not acceptable, but cows or cattle are acceptable. The Torah simply defines it that way. These you can eat, these you can't eat. I would also point out that many people seem to be under the impression that Jewish dietary laws really had to do with health. In ancient times, they didn't have refrigeration and so on. Their trichinosis in pork is well known, and therefore they avoided pork, and so on. The Torah makes no mention of health whatsoever. It's all about holiness, not health. It's about being a separate people and distinguishing ourselves in terms of what we eat. So we've already seen alluded to the laws of kosher slaughter, right? As you might remember, I think we talked about this last time. Once we are required only to sacrifice in God's chosen place where God has manifested God's name, that is, as we understand later, Jerusalem, once the temple is built there under King David. So since you can only do there, well, you're allowed to eat meat, even though it's not a sacrifice, which prior to you could eat meat only by going to your local sanctuary and they're making a sacrifice and sharing that meal with God. So now you're allowed to eat meat, but we're told very specifically, but not the blood, not the blood. And so we already have a kind of dietary restriction. Here we're going to be told what we can eat, what we can't eat. That is to say, what animals we can eat and what animals can't we eat. There is no restriction on vegetation, fruit, vegetables, all those things. Presumably you can eat whatever you want. So what can you not eat? Well, what can you eat? And then we get a list of, ox, sheep, goat, deer, gazelle, roebuck, wild goat, ibex, antelope, mountain sheep. And now we go from the specific to the general, and that is any animal that has true hoofs, which are cleft in two, and brings up the cud, chews its cud, that you can eat. Why that should be? Not stated. We really have no idea why that's something that's permissible. Animals that their hoof is not divided or they don't chew their cud, they're not ruminants, you can't eat them. And now we're going to get a list. Following, don't bring up the cud, don't have true hoofs. You may not eat camel hair, damen, for although they bring up the cud, they have no hoofs, true hoofs, they're impure. And swine, for although it has true hoofs, it does not bring up the cud, that's impure. And I would note the words impure for you. That is to say, any other people is perfectly allowed to do that. Nothing wrong with it, nothing inherently wrong with eating these animals, except that as a holy people, you have special rules. And now we go on, you may eat of all that live in the water, you may eat anything, that is to say, all of them, but really, among all the things that live in the water, it has to have fins and scales. You may not eat anything that has no fins and scales. And as you may know, actually, the question of what has fins, or actually what has scales, is not entirely clear. Fins are obvious, but what about an animal, a fish, that has scales as when it's, after it's comes into being? I was going to say born, but I don't know that fish are quite born. But anyway, once at the beginning, they have scales, and then they lose them. Right? There are fish like that, and principally swordfish. Sturgeon also has plates, and they lose plates. And so there have there's been an active halachic debate. Can you eat swordfish or not? Yes, they seem to fulfill the criteria, but not at the time in which you actually eat them. Right? You don't eat an immature little swordfish, you wait till it grows. And as you may know, in general, Orthodox Jews of various types do not eat swordfish. Many conservative Jews do eat swordfish. The fact it has scales at one time is enough. Now, in terms of birds, we also get a list. And the birds that you can't eat are listed here. We don't get the ones that you can eat, but if you look at the list, eagles, vultures, black vultures, the kite, the falcon, the buzzard, every variety of raven, ostrich, and so on. In general, though not completely, this seems to be a list of birds of prey. And that's notable, and many authorities try to group them together. I don't know that that's really valid. And the only reason why I say that is the other lists, right, start by other kinds of animals, give you specific names of animals, and then a general principle, right? You can't eat these things because their hooves are not cloven, right? Or you can't eat this because it doesn't have fins and scales. There's a general principle that follows specifics. And here we get no general principle. Just, okay, these birds. And so you could argue, well, since there's no general principle, there's no general listed, there isn't a general principle, and it really doesn't have to do with birds of prey. On the other hand, it's very striking that they are birds of prey. And then winged swarming things are impure. They can't be eaten. You can only eat pure winged creatures. So it doesn't say exactly what pure winged creatures are. Here it's not even a general principle. It's just, oh, you know what the pure winged creatures are. And in fact, the pure winged creatures, at least according to tradition, are hopping or leaping locusts. That is to say, grasshoppers and various other kinds of locusts. So if you have, and you know that bugs are eaten in some cultures. You can even get, I understand, though I've never had it and don't really have a desire to, you can get chocolate-covered bugs that have a hexture on them, crunchy and chocolatey, and maybe you like that kind of thing. It's possible to find them, though I don't know where. And here we get, again, this idea, it's consecrated, and now we get an interesting regulation. To my knowledge, we've seen lists, kashrut lists before, but now we get something else. You can't eat anything that has died a natural death. That is to say, anything that has not been properly slaughtered, right? You could say, for example, one thing that would be included here is you can't eat roadkill. Right? They didn't have roadkill in the time of the Bible, right? But it's not exactly a natural death after all, but it wasn't slaughtered. So an animal that dies without being slaughtered is assumed to have died either from old age, when you probably wouldn't eat it, or some kind of defects, some kind of illness, something like that. Again, this isn't health, but for some reason this is forbidden. And this leads to a question. What if you slaughter the animal, but it had a defect which would have led to its death? So you slaughter it, and then after the shochet slaughters the animal, it has to be, there's a process called bidikah, in which the animal, the carcass, right, is examined to make sure that there isn't something which could have caused its death or would have caused its death. And this is this examination to disqualify something which has some kind of defect, internal defect, leads to what's called glatt kosher meat. What is glatt kosher meat? It's meat where the lung of the animal, when it is examined, is found to be not smooth. And it's got sort of indentations in it. And glatt means smooth. Right? So something that is glatt kosher is where the lung is glatt, where it's smooth. Now, there are a certain percentage of animals have this naturally. It's not a defect at all. It's just a variation on the lung. And therefore, there's no reason to say that this meat particularly, there was some defect, that just naturally occurring fact. So glatt kosher began where people said, yes, essentially they said, yes, I understand that this is a natural thing, but it's possible that in the case of this particular animal, it was a defect. That is, it was a naturally smooth animal, and then some sort of defect came into it later. And therefore, because of this doubt, I choose not to eat it. It's kosher, no question it's kosher, but I choose to hold a higher standard. Right? That is the origin of glatt. It has become, however, synonymous in general with a higher standard of kashrut, even when you're not talking about lungs in fowl. Anytime a person says, well, it's okay, but I, of course, wouldn't eat it, right? You know, it's good for you, but I hold this higher standard. That becomes glatt. And glatt, the term glatt, therefore, gets associated to all kinds of things that may not even have anything to do with meat. Beyond that, because of what's happened within the Orthodox community, this sort of increasing strictness, you know, sort of being more kosher than thou in some sense. Oh, you eat it, okay, but I, right? That kind of thing has led to the fact that it's hard to get non-glatt meat today. Hebrew National sells non-glatt meat, right? But in increasing, they're kind of the end of it. So it's I think in itself a striking fact. But in any case, nothing that has died of a natural death can be eaten. You can give it to the stranger in your community, right? These are your resident aliens. They're not Jewish, right? But they're living in the land. They have a great many protections. They're treated, in fact, like citizens. However, they're not actually Jews, so they don't have to maintain this highest standard, so you could give it to them. Now, the assumption is that resident aliens, right, don't have land, so they tend to be poor. So here we're not talking about selling it to them, talking about giving it to them, or you can sell it to a foreigner, somebody who isn't a resident alien, but you are a consecrated people, so you don't eat it. Now, this idea of selling the meat to a foreigner is fairly commonplace in the kosher industry. In fact, if you know the animal is checked and there is a defect, it gets sold to a non-kosher butcher. There is in the book of Genesis a particular requirement that Jewish people not eat a certain nerve, which is in the thigh of an animal, the sciatic nerve, because when Jacob was wrestling with an angel back in Genesis, he got an injury there. And so as a reminder of that, and that's when he becomes Israel, and he gets the name Yisrael when he wrestles with the angel. No longer will you be called Jacob, but Israel. So we continue to remember that moment, and we don't eat it. You can remove that thing, but it's very difficult to do, and you really need very specialized knowledge. So in general, this hind quarter of the animal is sold to non-kosher butchers because we can't get it out, as it were. In Israel, where meat is much more expensive, they have people who have this expertise. It's removed, and that means certain cuts of meat which aren't available here are available there. It's called trabering, this removal. So if you want to get filet mignon, go to Israel because they're able to separate it out, but here they can't. Okay, and then we come to this last kosher law. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. It doesn't say why, and there are a variety of theories as to why. Just to mention two, Maimonides states that this was a pagan practice, a fertility ritual of some kind, perhaps, and therefore it's forbidden because of that. Not so clear. We do other things that pagans did to serve their gods, not the least of which is to offer sacrifices, right? They did, we do. Another idea is that it's symbolically cruel. We have a law, we'll see it, that if you want to take the fledglings from a nest or take the eggs, you shoo away the hen. Right? They shouldn't have to see their young being taken, right? This is in general, animals are to be treated extremely well. In Judaism, it's called tsar balei chayim, which means causing pain to a living animal, a living being, and we're not to do that. Perhaps this has to do, at least symbolically, with that. The milk, which was meant to nurture the kid, its mother's milk, is now being used to kill it. Regardless, this is a reference only to goats, but it's been understood in the Jewish tradition much more broadly. It's been understood to include any kind of milk and meat, not just limited to goats. And in fact, by extension, even milk with animals that are not mammals. There is no mother's milk that would have nurtured this animal. And here we're thinking perhaps about a chicken, right? Fowl, still it is traditional not to mix fowl with and ironically, I think, if you want to, though, you can, take egg yolk and baste your chicken with egg yolk before you cook it. Fish is not included here, presumably because fowl was offered on the altar. Fish is not. Fowl lives on the land along with other animals that this would apply to. So the idea is really that you shouldn't confuse things. You don't have to worry about fish. So fish becomes neither milk nor meat. It's part. And now from here, we develop a whole host of regulations, only rabbinic, which talk about, separate dishes and everything else to make sure inadvertently even, dishes aren't clean or whatever it is, right? Or the dishes have somehow absorbed, they're porous enough, thinking about earthenware, for example, that there could be some contact. And so a great deal of the kosher laws really stem from this particular prohibition. This reminds me of a joke, which I'll share with you. So Moses is on Mount Sinai, and God says this passage, right? We also see it elsewhere, right? Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, yes, I understand. No milk and meat together. And God says, Moses, listen carefully. don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, yeah, I got it. Separate dishes, everything. All right, Moses, have it your way. That's the joke. At any rate, this is a fundamental principle of Jewish law. So we've looked at a little bit about mourning, and we've looked at kashrut. And before we go on, I'm going to open things up for questions. If anyone has anything, either on what we've looked at, or death and mourning, or the laws of kashrut, I'm happy to entertain your.
I have a question.
Okay.
How do the rabbis decide to choose which fish to eat and which fish not to eat? For example, with scales and fins, for example, the catfish. Catfish is forbidden.
Right. So catfish, I'm assuming, doesn't have scales. I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I don't think it does. And it's that simple. There are lists, by the way, you can Google it. You'll get lists of, it's not just catfish. There are other, I'm trying to remember what. There was one that was very common in seafood markets at one time. I haven't seen it. I guess it's out, fished out, but there was one that you would see a lot, and wasn't kosher. Shark, by the way, is not kosher. There are others. Sharks have fins, but they don't have scales. It's that kind of. Any other questions about kashrut or anything having to do with how we mourn the dead or what we don't do? Sandy, go ahead, and then Barry. Sandy?
Right. So, Rabbi, I saw this wonderful video about talking about which animals should be killed and which not. It's not about us, about our health, but it's about the animal's health, and about it's scientific, showing that the vein or the artery to the kosher animals, meaning like the cow, versus the pig, that when the animal is slaughtered, because of the physiology, and in the video it goes into it in very much detail, that the animal, it cuts off the blood supply immediately to the brain and to the heart, whatever, so that the animal doesn't suffer. Whereas in the pig, it would not be the same way. The pig would suffer. And it says at the end that, wow, God set this up. We didn't know the reason then, but now we can look back at it and appreciate what it all means. And if anyone's interested, I can send the video link.
Okay, fair enough. But again, I would say that what we're talking about here is, this is what you do if you're Jewish, if you're an Israelite, as opposed to others, which suggests that there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that, right? So I personally hesitate to, just as I hesitate to think about Maimonides, who says it was a pagan practice. Each generation has tried to find its own reason and meaning, and they may well be inherent, right? And that may indeed be what's intended here. I don't want to suggest it's impossible. I do want to suggest, however, that we really don't know. These things are, and I think there is a certain value in not knowing. In other words, if I could argue that this, so this is why I do this, right? Because of the pig, and it's pain or non-pain. Then it's not about doing it because I'm Jewish, or doing it because I believe God's commanded it, and I'm doing it to show that I'm part of this sacred people, but I'm doing it for this or that. So I thank you for mentioning it, and certainly if people would like the video, I would encourage them to get it. But for myself, I don't want to simply confine it to that possibility. Barry, you had your hand.
Thank you.
You're muted, I'm sorry. You're still muted.
It's here, okay. Okay, so going back to mourning for the dead, there's a tradition where you rip your clothing.
Right.
Is there
So
any
that,
connection to that?
no, I don't think so.
Because here it
Um,
is, because
right,
you're not
but
cut
you-
yourself, so instead of cutting yourself. perhaps
Yeah, it's an interesting theory. And you know, I don't know, right? But these things do evolve. And I was, as I mentioned earlier, you know, so you can't shave up here, and maybe that leads to not being able to shave down here also when you're a mourner. So it's possible. I don't know. Except that it goes back really far, this idea of not tearing your clothing. I mean, we know King David does it when he's mourning. So, but having said that, yeah, maybe, I don't know. You know that this custom of tearing your clothing, you know, today people often use a ribbon. They tear the ribbon and they wear it rather than actually tearing their clothing. It's not just limited to mourning for people. So there's a tradition that if you go to Jerusalem and you come to the wall or the Temple Mount, you see the place where the temple stood. As a sign of mourning for the temple, you should tear your clothes, right? Which I think is, I haven't seen anybody do it, but it's certainly, as it were, on the books. So I'll mention that as well. Any other questions about kashrut or mourning before we go on? So let's go on. 1 second. Okay, so now we're going to talk about tithes, something else that we are required to do as holy people. Tithing, you know, literally means it's from 10, and it's a tenth of your produce. And it's done in different years and for different reasons. So we've already seen back, I think it was in the book of Leviticus, that we have a certain kind of tithing for the poor that, you know, in addition to, there are several things that are done as relief for the poor. One is not to cut the corners of your fields, you know, that you actually should cut around the corners, right? So that the corners are left for the poor who can come and harvest it. They're allowed to come and glean in your fields for the grain that, you know, fell and that you didn't pick up. They're entitled to that. Can't say it's private property, get out. They're entitled to do that. We also have the forgotten sheaf. If you have harvested and you've taken your grain and you put it into sheaves, and now you realize, oh, I left one in the field. Too bad. The poor can come. Once you're gone, they can come, they can take it. Even though it's been harvested for you, they get it, right? And they get a tithe. That poor tithe is not mentioned here. And there's also a tithe for the Levite who has no land. We do get a sense of that. And by extension, you should know that the tithe for the Levite is also tithed by the Levite and given to the Kohen, to the priests. And from that, we have a principle, which is that everyone has to give a tithe. Even someone who is a recipient of tzedakah has him or herself to give tzedakah. That is, it's a general obligation, and I think it maintains a strong sense of dignity, and that's what a lot of these laws are about, not only providing for the poor, but doing so in a way that helps to maintain their dignity. Here, that system of tithes gets incorporated into this, though it's not explicit, but here we are told that we are going to tithe new grain, wine, and oil, the firstlings of herds and flocks, and you're going to take it and consume it in the presence of God in the place that God will establish God's name, so that you will revere the Lord your God forever. So take the tithe. This is done in this first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the cycle. There's a 7-year cycle. And in those years, you're going to take this portion and you're going to eat it as part of your celebration, as a shared meal with God in the place that God has chosen, presumably during the pilgrimage festivals. Now, we have another idea, and that is, if you are unable to transport it because the place God has chosen is too far from you, and because the Lord has blessed you, right? God's blessed you, so you have a lot. Right? Presumably, if you haven't gotten a lot, you can take your bag of grain and go turn it into money, sell it, and then take the proceeds, go to Jerusalem, use the money to buy the means of celebration, and you'll do it there with that. Spend the money on anything you want, cattle, sheep, wine, any intoxicant, anything you desire. You'll feast there in the presence of the Lord your God, and you will rejoice. I want to emphasize the word rejoice. If you look at the Hebrew, v'samachta, you should have simcha. This is about not only thanking God for what God's given you, but the Torah wants us to enjoy, to have a sense of joy, gratitude, and I think that's important to emphasize, right? That simcha is a positive value. There's this remarkable statement, I think, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. That is there are two Talmuds, one which is universally studied by those who study Talmud, which was compiled in Babylonia. It's called the Babylonian Talmud. But there's also a Talmud of the land of Israel. And in the Talmud of the land of Israel, we get the statement that when one comes to being judged in the next world, we will have to account for all the legitimate pleasures of this world we failed to enjoy. Right? So not only do we have to be honest, for example, and righteous, but we're supposed to enjoy. And if we don't, this is a gift that God has given us, and we're turning down this gift that God has given us. And so it is important, holidays are important as opportunities to rejoice. Now, when you do that, don't neglect the Levite in your community. He has no hereditary portion. Therefore, he, unlike you, doesn't have the means of taking a tithe and enjoying it. Every third year, you should bring the full tithe of your yield for that year, but leave it within your settlements. The Levite who has no hereditary portion, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, they will eat their fill so that the Lord your God may bless you. And now we get the issue of debts and the sabbatical year. So every 7 years, we learn that the land is to lie fallow. We'll talk about that when we get to it, that idea of it lying fallow. But here, we're concerned with debts. So you shall practice every 7 years, and it's actually Mikate Sheva Shanim, at the end of 7 years, that is, and the rabbis say this is sundown on the last day of the 7th year, 7 complete years. And there's a cycle, right? And every year I don't know what we're in now, but the cycle continues to this day. And, we're in the 4th year or the 5th year or the 6th year of this process. And then every 7 years, debts are canceled. So if you owe someone money, no matter how long, whatever the terms were, if you come to the 7th year and you haven't repaid, you're free. No need to repay debts. There are certain debts that the rabbis understand as being exempt. For example, if you owe your workers wages, you can't just say, oh, sorry, you did the work, but I'm sorry, I'm not giving it to you, or, things like that. But in general, now understand what loans are. Loans are actually a form of tzedakah. You're not allowed to charge interest. It's a separate law in Deuteronomy. So somebody's in bad shape and they come to you and you loan them money. Perhaps you're even loaning them money without any expectation of being repaid necessarily, because there's a certain dignity in taking a loan rather than taking a handout, as it were. But perhaps, you expect to be repaid. Regardless, you are not entitled to collect once the 7th year has come to an end. This is the nature of remission. Every creditor shall remit the due he claims from his fellow. He shall not dun his fellow or his kinsman. The remission is proclaimed by the Lord. You may dun the foreigner, right? So this is, this is the idea of Jews as a family, right? Our kinsmen, we look out for each other. But actually for a non-Jew, it's not canceled. And actually you can charge interest for a non-Jew. And then there's this statement, there shall be no needy among you. The Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord has given you as a hereditary portion. So there shouldn't be. But actually, human nature being what it is, people don't share evenly, and therefore there will be, inequities. Even though there shouldn't be, given that there is enough for everyone, there shouldn't be, but there will be. And so how do we deal with those inequities? And one way we deal with the inequities is that a person should not be allowed to be perpetually in debt. Right? They need to be able to get out from under that debt. I'm struck by the fact that there's a lively debate going on now about college loans, right? Money that's owed to the government and whether or not the government can cancel those things, right? It's become a contentious political issue. So, but this idea that a person should not be in perpetual debt is something the Torah is concerned about. And we see it here. If you'll only heed the Lord your God, take care from these instructions. The Lord will bless you as God has promised. You will extend loans to many nations, but require none yourself. You will dominate many nations. They will not dominate. So if you do the right thing, it'll be great. If, however, there is a needy person, one of your kinsmen among your settlements, do not harden your heart and shut your hand against your needy kinsman, right? Rather, you must open your hand and lend him sufficient for whatever he needs. Beware lest you harbor the base thought, the 7th year, the year of remission is approaching, right? You're happy to loan money when it's 6 years away, sure, because you'll get it back. But now, it's the middle of the 7th year. You've got only 6 months to be repaid. Well, don't say that. Be open-handed and don't be mean and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you and you will incur guilt. Give him readily and have no regrets. For return, the Lord your God will bless you in all your efforts and your undertakings, because there will never cease to be needy ones in your land, which is why I command you to open your hand to the poor and to the needy. Okay, so it's worth noting that despite Moses' statements here, it doesn't really work. That is to say, people do become closed-handed. And so we have something really remarkable in the time of the Second Temple, that Hillel, who is one of the two leading authorities of the day, figures out a way, even though the Torah is absolutely explicit here, figure out a way to make sure that loans are repaid, even though they're not supposed to be after the end of the 7th year. It's very famous. It's called prosbul, right? And the way it works is no, the debtor does not have to repay the lender, but the debtor has to pay a court, and the court will make the lender whole. Because presumably this law has unintended consequences, the very consequence that Moses was afraid of, and that is that credit dries up, and the poor are not able to get the relief that they wanted.
Josh,
Now,
congratulations
this
on a beautiful
change
record, and thank you so much
in-
for it. For all your time.
Somebody needs to mute because we can hear you if you're talking. Thank you. This prosbul, which Hillel creates, this workaround, is known by a technical term. It is a tikkun. You know the word tikkun olam, improving or fixing the world. This is a kind of tikkun, which is meant to bring the intent of the letter of the law back to its intent. Since this cancellation of debts was intended as a way of helping the poor, and it's not working, and Moses knew it might not work. He warned them, right? It's not working, and so we create a workaround, which is, remarkable because the Torah is quite explicit, right? Debts are canceled. It's an audacious thing to do.
It's like an amendment to our Constitution.
Yeah, it's kind of an amendment. Yes, I think that's true. But it's an amendment. Remember that it's an amendment which, in a sense, cancels the whole law, right? Because it says, no, debts are no longer canceled in the 7th year. It's remarkable to me that Hillel had the chutzpah to do this. But Hillel in general was a figure that was concerned with the poor. So we're just about out of time. So I hesitate to do this, but I'm going to do it. And that is, there's a classic problem with agunot, women who can't get a divorce. And therefore they can't remarry, and their husband's holding them up. A Jewish divorce I'm talking about. Maybe they've even gotten a secular divorce, but they can't get a Jewish divorce, and their husband's holding them up, and he's requiring them to extorting money or whatever it is, right? And so, this law, which is the law of divorce, is now being used to extort. And so how do you deal with that? And there have been a variety of modern attempts to do that, including in the conservative movement, retroactively nullifying the marriage. Right? So you could say, how could you do that? Right? But the law that exists is creating great evil. Right? So Justice Hillel did what he did, right? So the idea is we also should be able to fix things so that the intent of the law is just and not unjust. Now, the classic argument against that is, yeah, but he was Hillel. You're no Hillel, right? How dare you? You're just not on his level. He was there's an expression, he was a giant, and we are, midgets. To which the classic reply is, yes, but we are midgets who sit on the shoulders of giants. So I'll leave you with that. And let me switch to opening up for questions. And I welcome starting with Barbara.
Yeah, you were talking about gleanings, and actually we read about it in this week's Parsha and
Yes,
more.
yes, in Emor. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
for mentioning
because it's listing like the calendar. So mentioned Shabbat and then like Pesach, etc. But before it goes into like the other holidays, it has that in chapter 23, verse 22. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges, etc.
Right. And I would go, since you mentioned it, I would go a step further. I think it's really interesting that these concerns for the poor are stuck right in the middle of the holidays, which is
Right,
to
that's
say
it, yes.
you're supposed to go and rejoice, but don't forget, right, that they are not able to rejoice without your help. Good. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of stuff, and it's really fundamental stuff. We're going to go on next week to talk about slaves and how slaves are to be treated. And in that connection, if you live around here, I do want to mention that my podcast partner and I will be at his church doing our podcast live tomorrow night. That is the St. George's Episcopal Church, which is in Maplewood. If you can make it, it's at 7 o'clock. It'd be fun to see you. In any case, it is being recorded and will be sent out as a podcast afterwards, so you have a chance. We're both intrigued by this question of why the Bible, what do we do with the fact that the Bible seems to countenance slavery? And not just the Hebrew Bible, but the Christian Bible also seems to countenance slavery. So we're going to be talking about that. And then 2 weeks later, in our next podcast, we're going to be talking about the question of reparations. Long term, how do we respond to the fact in our country that this country was built in part by enslaved people? And what do we owe their descendants? So those two podcasts, one tomorrow night and one 2 weeks later. The one tomorrow night is at St. George's Episcopal, and if you're nearby, please come at 7, or at B'nai Shalom in West Orange. 2 weeks later, on the 17th, we'll be talking about reparations. Okay, have a great week. I look forward to seeing you all next week.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you,
Bye.
Rabbi.
All right, bye
See you
now.
tomorrow.